This is the Global Podcast Network, where executives and professionals connect, share, and inspire. Stay tuned for the conversations that drive success.
He truly is an infuser of hope. And what do I mean by that? When many of us are having challenges, physical challenges, we carry a lot on our shoulders, and I mean that figuratively and literally. He has studied and learned a technique that's been around for over 100 years that can make you feel so much better. And you can do it anywhere, anytime. It's relatively simple once you know about it. I'm referring to the Alexander technique. And we're going to dig into it today with your questions at instantfeedbacksteve@gmail.com and learn more about this wonderful technique from a neuromuscular and rehab specialist. And he's back with us with a lot of insight. Our professional of the year, Travis Chastain. On the program, how you doing?
Steve, I'm great. It's great to be back. It's good to see you.
It's been a while since we've talked, right?
Yeah. Heard you've been snowed in New York.
Talk about tension, holding tension. You just shovel 2.5 feet of snow. You're probably going to be holding some tension for a little while, right?
That's a lot of stimuli, Steve. A lot of stimuli.
So the Alexander technique, it's been a while since we've really gone into the depth of what it is. We've talked about different applications of it and so forth. Let's go back to basics. What is this technique?
The Alexander technique is really an examination of the connection between thinking and the way thinking impacts our physiology, how our bodies respond, right? Specifically, what FM was contending with was he had a really big problem, and his problem was that he was running into vocal paralysis every time he was going to go recite. And that's a pretty big deal if you're an actor, right? It's a big deal if you're a human being, period, but as an actor, especially if your livelihood depends on things like that, vocalizations, right? And the quality of your vocalizations. He was running into vocal paralysis. He was just losing his voice over and over and over again every time he went to recite. Now, what's important about his story is what he noticed, right? What he noticed that when he went to go recite, the cause of his physical problem was, as what he described, an undue tension that he was loading in his body in what he called the primary control, his head, his neck, and his back relationship. Okay. And I'm pointing to my torso because that's what he meant by back relationship, the entirety of the torso. Mm-hmm. And what he noticed was a very, very particular pattern of tension where the back of his neck would tighten. And that, if this is the top of the head and this is the neck, that caused his head to get pulled, as he described it, back and down against the spine, like so. Now, it's just a matter of physics that when you take the head out of balance in relationship to gravity, that causes a whole lot of compensatory measures in the rest of the back, right? Any chiropractor is going to tell you that, for example, right? And so, what he noticed was this pulling the head back and down. It caused, as he described, a shortening in the back and a hollowing out in the back, which caused a whole lot of problems in his breathing, his capacity for his ribs to move. And he discovered that was the cause of the physical cause of part of his paralysis, right? There was this physical shape that he was in. But what's more interesting than the physical shape was what he started to notice when he was trying to fix that. When he was trying to fix the physical shape, there was something very interesting that was happening. Despite his best attempts to put his head in the right position, right, to take that pressure off of his larynx, and despite practicing trying to do this and get himself into a better shape directly, and despite even feeling as if he had made some shifts, when it came back time to get back to reciting, well, he lost his voice again, despite feeling that he is making improvements, right? And the reason for that is because he had habits. He had habits in response to the stimuli of reciting that his best intentions, as he described it, couldn't overcome. Because what he was looking for was something that was a bit outside of his sense experience. And he discovered a vicious problem about this habit of tension. This habit of tension that he was having, was so closely associated with his perception of his own being, right? That his very feeling of being right was tied to this habit of tension. In other words, his proprioception, his sense of himself in space, was tied to these habits. And no matter how hard he tried directly to do anything about it, he just couldn't get himself out of it. It would seem to be one of those kind of catch-22 problems.
Why do you think he was stuck in that mode? And by the way, we talked about him before, FM Alexander, and he was a performer on stage. And back 150 years ago, they didn't have PA systems, they didn't have amplification. No. You were on stage, you needed to project, and he felt like he wasn't projecting enough. And you've never said these two words, but I got it now, about the angst that he must have had. This is his livelihood. Vocal paralysis. Whoa.
Yeah.
Frozen.
Yeah, he just couldn't do it. And it had to do with these tension patterns. And what was worse is these tension patterns were inescapable for him. Right? And the reason they were inescapable is how profoundly deep habit goes. When we get into a habit, we don't even necessarily know we're in the habit, right? Habits, that's just the nature of habits. Habits are both a good thing and a bad thing. They're a little bit of a double-edged sword. They make life possible, right? Because they're running underneath the surface all the time. But what happens when one of those things goes really wildly wrong? What do you do about something like that, right? The more interesting part of the story is when he was in a place of desperation and exasperation, where, he tried everything. He tried everything he could think of to get himself in a better position, a better shape. And one day he was back in the experimenting table in front of the mirror. He tried to figure some things out again. And as if I recall the story correctly, he was just thinking about acting, just thinking about his lines. He hadn't even gone into the act of acting, right? He hadn't even physically begun. But he was noticing that his body was still tightening. His neck was still tightening and pulling his head back and down, even before he had decided to speak. Right? So at this point, he discovered what's truly unique about the technique is that his mind was saying yes to reciting before he had begun. You might call that anticipation. And his body was already rehearsing those habits of tension. So what that means is that his thinking was in some big way influencing the shape of his body. The way he was thinking, just saying yes, just preparing, was enough to get him into those old familiar ways. But from that little piece of observation came the gold, and I would say the thing that is truly unique, special, and different about the Alexander technique is that he learned and devised a system of principles, thinking principles, to keep himself detached, if you will, from the goal of speaking. And by living by those principles, he detached himself from the habits of tension that was ruining his life.
Mm. I can't
And it was
imagine
awesome.
what he
Yeah.
was going through, the angst, knowing that, all right, well, I'm performing in tomorrow night.
Yeah.
And now just even thinking about it, he may think, oh, I'm in a better place. I'm going to project, I'm going to be all right. But because that tension had become a habit, he's locking up. He's almost freezing and may not even know it until, the night of the show. You found this technique out of a personal struggle yourself, right?
Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah. In a past life, I was also pursuing a classical guitar degree in graduate school, all
Mm.
right, becoming a master of music. And 2 years prior, I was involved in a car wreck, caused a bad compression in my C6, C7 vertebra.
Mm.
And that new shape that the car wreck brought me in, I brought those habits of my shape into the instrument. And to be fair, like most musicians, I had already learned how to use myself rather inefficiently on the instrument anyway. And, the combination was lethal for me. I woke up one day after practicing about 3 hours, like I typically did, 3 to 5 hours a day. And I woke up the next morning and all I remember is just being in horrible pain in my upper back, and having this weakness in my arm. And, that weakness continued to grow and grow and grow until painkillers couldn't do anything about it anymore. And at that point, I went to go to the doctors to see if they had a solution for me. The primary care doctor said, well, I don't see anything specifically wrong with your back, but we'll go to the physical therapist and see what they say. They gave me exercises. The exercises only made it worse.
Mm.
And then I went to get operated on, get a cortisone injection, steroid shot, essentially, to relieve the swelling in my C6, C7 vertebra. And while it took the edge off temporarily of my pain, it didn't do anything to help me get back onto my instrument. All right. And, the refreshing thing that was there for me for the Alexander technique is that it wasn't a therapy in which somebody was doing something to me. It was an investigation of how I was moving and behaving in response to stimuli, how my muscles were moving and responding to the stimuli to play the instrument, the classical guitar, how my muscles were responding and behaving in response to the stimuli of walking, right? And what what things might be good about that, but also things that were interfering and things that were unnecessary about what I was doing. All right. And, my first experience with the Alexander technique is an experience that is rather common for most of us, is that when I learned through the guidance of a teacher, to release that tension that I was unknowingly carrying in my neck, I had no idea. All right. And I had my head in a little bit better position and had my back in a bit better of a alignment and agreement with my head. And then I decided to act that out into movement. I mean, the first experience I had was, wow, why do I feel 10 pounds lighter? Right.
Wow.
I wasn't 10 pounds lighter. That would be physically impossible. Right. But, what I was is I was more aligned in that undue pressure that I was so used to putting on myself. That undue pressure and undue stress and strain from that misalignment that was reinforced mentally, physically in everything that I did. through the use of the principles, thinking principles of the technique, that was shattered temporarily. And a new neuromuscular pathway was forming through my movements. That was the beginning of effortlessness in my life.
You've talked about this before when we first got together, but thank you for the detail and the depth, because one thing that, aside from you releasing the tension, being able to play more fluidly and things like that, feeling 10 pounds lighter, never thought about that. But when you think about it, you know, it's almost as when you have that tension, especially we all hold it, many of us, in our neck and shoulders and things like that, that it feels like there's pressure on you, like it could be a weight, a 10-pound weight. And you don't know it until it gets released and you have a completely different feeling. Never looked at it that way, but I can't imagine how much better you felt, you know, once you dug into the technique.
Oh yeah, I mean, because it gave me, that's when I gave me hope. Because, not only did it make me feel better, I think the thing that was encouraging for me was not necessarily even that I felt better, but it was giving me instruction on how to feel better for myself, Steve. Right? In practical things, not like, okay, I'm going to go stand on my head in some yoga practice. I'm going to just practice engaging with the thinking principles of the technique in everyday movements like sitting and standing to get a better coordination out of my body. Right? To practice the principles of the Alexander technique in everyday movements like walking to get a better coordination out of my body in this moment. Right? Or breathing. It's something we do all the time anyway, to get a better coordination out of my whole body. As it turns out, breathing is an act of coordinating the whole body. And that's something that FM Alexander also discovered.
Wow. I give him a lot of credit. Back then we didn't have cameras to take pictures. We didn't have, he's looking in a mirror trying to, I would assume, he must have been obsessed with mirrors. Probably had a whole bunch set up as he looks at himself, one mirror looking at the other mirror. And again, this is 150 years ago. Not an easy task. Even, I don't think mirrors, you find them everywhere. You probably had to be intentional where to get all of that stuff to come up with this discovery. Can we go to some emails?
Sure, my friend. Let's do it.
We have Marcus checks in from Chicago, instantfeedbacksteve@gmail.com, and says, how is the Alexander technique different from yoga or Pilates?
Right. Well, I will say that's a great question, Marcus. I mean, they're both working on alignment processes. Pilates is focusing a lot on the pelvis and down. We tend to focus more on the whole self a little bit more than they do, in my opinion. But beyond that, I would say that the difference is the depth in which the Alexander technique takes the problem of habit seriously. Right. The thing that FM Alexander noticed is that he was tightening his neck and pulling his head back and down in response to all stimuli. That was happening first by consenting mentally to a stimuli, and then it happened to his body second, right? And he was doing it in everything. So the Alexander technique is really, really, really takes that problem, in my opinion, way deeper than anything I've ever seen. Pilates is great. They do a lot of exercises, but I don't think that they account nearly as well as FM Alexander's technique does on considering the tension patterns in which you're going to necessarily bring into that activity because of the fact that it's just your most familiar way of being. And that the only thing that is required, for example, if you're doing a Pilates exercise, to initiate those habits of tension, which are unitary from the head all the way down to the feet, driven by this head-neck-back relationship, is what FM called the primary control. The only thing that's required to dive into that, even a little bit, is just to say yes to it. Right? The technique is a little bit more cerebral, I would say, in the fact that it says, well, before you do, say no to doing, to get your nervous system a little bit more reset. Think about what you want from in terms of the quality of your head, neck, and back relationship first, then take the action, then take the positive action. Don't just take the positive action, because it's not actually going to be a positive action, Steve. You haven't gotten rid of the habit. You have to get rid of the habit first. You got to put yourself in a neutral setting first. I know that's a long answer, but it's the best I got, because that's the fundamental difference, is the degree in which FM knew the problem of habit and the degree in which he solved that problem through utilizing how you think in activity first, resetting yourself first, and then doing.
We have other questions. One just came to mind for me. FM Alexander, he was a performer.
Yes.
Theatrics, stage. Is this technique pretty commonly taught in drama schools?
Yes. Yes. In fact, I would say, most of the great actors of the English school in which we admire, like Alan Rickman, for example. We all know Alan Rickman, hopefully, Die Hard, the bad guy in Die Hard, the bad guy in Robin Hood, Snape, to bring it more to the modern era. He was a huge aficionado of the technique. He loved the technique, and he embodied it marvelously, I would say. And Judi Dench, for example, Benedict Cumberbatch, Hugh Jackman.
Wow.
They're all enthusiasts of the Alexander technique, right? They all use the Alexander technique regularly in their life. Yeah.
Huh. Never even thought of that. I just popped in my head thinking about, being on stage or even just performing in front of a camera where you might be holding tension. You might be stressed out. You might be, let's say, even somebody new. If it's new for them, they probably have some butterflies, some jitters, things like that. What's that going to do? It's going to manifest in stress and anxiety. You're going to be holding tension. We all hold tension, don't we?
Oh yeah, we all do. Yeah, I think the way that Alan Rickman said it really works too, because anytime you're a professional at anything, in this case, Alan Rickman was a professional actor, and he used to say that, well, as actors, we do a thing, and we do a thing over and over and over again, and it's really easy to just. It's really easy just to get in little habits of holding artificial tensions here and tensions here, which just trap the energy.
Sure.
Right. And then it prevents you from really being authentic in your expression of your art. Right. And so, but it also just prevents you just from being authentic in your expression of your God-given soul. To be truthful, it just does. And, the technique does help you with just kindly noticing those things. And as it turns out, it just takes some awareness, a little bit of a moment of pausing to redirect the energy. And something more new and beautiful comes out of it.
This is going to be a little woo for a moment here, but we all want to be authentic. That's where we should be. Our authentic self. And if there's a reason that you're not being truly you, maybe influence from other people or whatever it might be, something always feels off. Or if you're acting in a certain way because you think you have to around another person, you're not really being authentic. I have to imagine that we can't truly be ourselves when we're holding tension. We don't want to hold tension. It's happening because of factors around us, nerves, an injury. You know, you didn't ask for that car accident. It happened, but you couldn't be your authentic self because that was holding you back. And I got to imagine something feels off within our bodies when we're not being our true self. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, yeah. I mean, I guess the thing that I'd like to say about that, because that's a great point, Steve, is, you look at the child. We've talked about this before, right? My gosh, they're beautiful. You look at like a little 1-year-old just learning how to walk, and have you ever seen anybody with a soul who doesn't look at that and just smile?
They make them cute for a reason when they keep you up all night.
Yeah. Well, yeah, right. I know. There's
I know you. I know you know.
There's that side of it for sure. But they just have that natural grace.
Yeah.
They do. They have the and it's expressed not only in their smile, but just how open and easy they are.
Because I believe that a young child, and I'm talking young,
Yes.
2, 3, 4, 5, up in that area, they're being themselves. And I believe when a baby's born, that's your true self. It's right there. Mm-hmm. Things get in the way. Along the way, you experience life, you internalize certain things, you hear things, you think they're one thing, you might hear something, that's not even for you, but you hold on to it. And then you start getting away from what your true self was. Now add stress, anxiety as you get older. Now add car accidents, chronic issues, and you're further away from what your true self was designed to be when you were born.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's what I think Alan Rickman was hitting on. It's like, as a classical guitarist, for example, we're always looking to our left to play the instrument.
Mm.
Right. And, and if you're in the process of what F.M. Alexander called end gaining, and that simply means, you're focusing on the goal and not yourself in pursuit of the goal. Right. Like, a practical example of that would be, well, I'm playing the classical guitar and I'm turning to the left and I want to play this phrase of Bach sublimely. Right. And, just the language that I gave right there can, when I mentally entertain just making it about the music, the thing that happens to our brains is that we so focus on the music, we become experientially blind to ourselves. What are we bringing into our bodies? In the pursuit of that sublimity or just getting it right, whatever it is that our end goal is, our end gaining was, the big problem with that, and this is what F.M. Alexander was noticing. The big problem with that is that it makes us experientially blind to all other realities, all other factors. It's a little bit like, okay, I tell you, Steve, there's a highway of stimuli running across your system right here. I want you to focus on just the red cars going by.
Mm.
Right? Well, now there could be white cars, there could be blue cars there could be green cars there, but guess what? You're not seeing any of that. You're seeing just what you've been programmed to see. It's red, right? And you're seeing just what you've been programmed to see. You're looking at the left to play your guitar, and all you're seeing is, I got to get this phrase right. And you're not at all seeing, until it's become devastating to your body, by the way, you're not at all seeing, oh man, I'm really, really contracting in my ribs, for example.
It's the last thing on your mind.
It's the last thing on the mind. But you imagine that. You imagine this, though. Let's dive deeper. You imagine that you end gain 3 to 5 hours a day on getting a piece of music right, and then you've embodied these habits of tension of torquing and twisting your torso to the left.
Sure.
Well, guess what? Now you're going to walk with that, which is going to reinforce it more. And guess what? Now when you go to sit down, and now you're going to activate that habit when you go sit down. And guess what? When you go brush your teeth, now you're going to activate that pattern when it's a vicious problem. And that's what FM was onto. It's a vicious problem when we stop listening to ourselves in the pursuit of goals. And that's ultimately what the technique is about. Listen to yourself in pursuit of goal, not the goal itself.
Say that again.
Listen to yourself in pursuit of goal rather than goal itself. Listen to what habits of tension are wanting to behave in your head, neck, and back, for example, when you do that scale without judgment, or when you go for that walk without judgment. You'll learn a great deal. And then you're in a space of being able to change little bit by little bit. Right? But we all know this. You can't change what you don't see. Right? If you don't see it, if you're not listening for it, you have no hope of changing it. And you have no hope of being able to listen if you're focused on the goal to the exclusion of yourself. And that's ultimately what the technique is about, pure and simple. Switch the attention from the goal in which you seek to how you're pursuing the goal.
I think that's great advice in general. Not even, with the Cairo, Egypt. You can hear us anywhere. Like Fatima in Egypt checks in instantfeedbacksteve@gmail.com. Can someone learn the Alexander technique effectively from books or videos, or is working with a teacher in person essential?
That's a great question, Fatima. I would recommend that while you can get some great benefit out of books, and you can get some great benefit even out of videos. My goodness, even I'm designing videos to help people, right, with these sorts of things. You really want to make sure that you get some check-ins with coaches. It doesn't have to be in person if there isn't such a thing, but at the very least with an expert online, right? So that you understand the meaning behind the principles of the technique. Because for the principle of inhibition, for example, of non-doing can be a little bit confusing for a brand new student, right? Because what we'll do in a lesson, for example, is we'll give you the stimuli to walk, and then we'll have you mentally say no to it. All right, which is the purpose of that is to get you away from, again, focusing on the goal, and to get yourself a little bit more centered into your body, right? So that when you do decide to take the action, it's actually a different action. Right? It's actually a different habit that you're forming, right? But non-doing can be a little bit tricky unless you really understand the meaning behind the principle of non-doing. And the meaning behind the principle of non-doing is this. It's not that, wild horses won't make me walk. Wild horses won't make me stand. It's not that. That's suppression. That's unhealthy. What it is a moment to pause and recognize, that is something I could do. But there's something else I could do too. Or there's something not at all that I could do. See, that's what inhibition is. That's what non-doing is. It's not I won't do anything ever. It's I'm going to recognize a fact of life first, and then I'll decide. The fact of life is I do have a choice before I do this thing. I do have a choice not to do this thing. I do have a choice to do this thing differently. I do have this choice to do this thing not at all. I have a choice to do something entirely different, right? And there's something, that's really what FM hit on to when he was experimenting for himself, is that elusive freedom in his neck that which he sought only came about from that mental recognition of choice. Your mind and your nervous system love options. And it tells your mind, it signals to your nervous system that you're safe enough to explore efficiency. And if you don't mentally give that primer, that input, you're never going to get a different output in your body. If you don't give that mental input, you'll never get a different physical output. I hope that answers your question, Fatima. I would say if there's no teacher near you in Cairo, books are a great place to start. Online resources and online teachers are a great place to start. But you have to understand the meaning behind these words. You can't just hear a word and expect it's going to do anything for you. You have to understand the meaning behind it.
So you said 2 words a moment ago, and we have an email from Michael in Boston, and he says, many self-improvement methods focus on doing more. The Alexander technique seems to emphasize non-doing. Can you explain the psychological shift required to practice this?
Well, yeah, I mean, that is the shift. And that's really, really hard for a lot of us in the beginning, right? Because we're so used to those self-improvement methods say, do more, do more, do more.
Right.
You know, the Alexander technique is not at all opposed to action. But what it is saying is that, well, as an analogy, if you're putting a good seed, a positive thought in a poisonous terrain, a poisonous soil, that seed ain't growing, baby. It ain't going to do nothing for you. It's a waste of time and energy. And you know that because you feel it in the form of frustration when nothing ever changes. So the Alexander technique around non-doing is to say, from an analogy perspective, is first I got to clear the landscape, leave myself a neutral soil, then give the good word, and that good word will grow into a new, more efficient, healthy habit. But you can't do and do and do and expect to not bring everything that you've been doing in the past with it. You can't keep doing and doing and doing and expect that you're not going to bring what you do the best with it. And what we do the best is we tend, all of us as human beings, I don't think there's a single human being I've ever met, and I don't think there was a single human being that FM ever met, that doesn't get in the habit of just tightening the neck and pulling their head back and down in response to the stimuli of activity.
You think we all do it?
I've never seen a human being that doesn't, Steve.
Right? I can't imagine you wouldn't. Maybe not all the time, but during certain situations. Thinking about FM Alexander and those days 150 years ago, where I got to believe he became a little obsessed. Like, I need to perform. I can't. I have vocal paralysis. This is my livelihood. Is it possible when you're learning the technique or practicing it to be over self-monitoring, if that makes sense, or analytical?
Sure. Yes.
You know,
yeah,
kind of overdo it, maybe.
Yeah. Well, that would be just a different form of what we call end gaining in the Alexander technique, right? You know, again, we're really not all that concerned about what we feel in our body because we can't trust our feelings according to the principles of the Alexander technique. Yeah, because they're too tight. They're so tightly wound to our habits. Right? They're one and the same. So, no, we observe them, we acknowledge them, but we don't attach anything to them. And that's the key. That's the key to not obsessing, is just, well, yeah, let me think maybe for a second. Let me think this good thought, and then let me act on it with the knowledge that it's moved me in a different way. Right? When you stop the neuromuscular pathway. You give a good thought to redirect the energy. That creates a new neuromuscular pathway. Now all is up to you to do is act on it. And is it going to change the world? Of course not. But is it going to atomically, very microscopically change the way you moved? Like in a very tiny, subtle way? And then you do it again, and is it going to change the way you move again? Yes, that's what will happen. And before you know it, you're way different human being in the way you move, in the way your body feels. Right? But the spirit around the Alexander technique is a spirit of playful curiosity. If you're not in a place of playful curiosity, you're not doing the Alexander technique. You're doing something other than the Alexander technique. I don't know what it is you're doing, but it's not the Alexander technique. And I have to remind myself about that too, because I'm a serious guy, Steve.
I don't know about that. Maybe sometimes.
Sometimes, yeah.
How do you know it's working? Are there subtle signs that,
Yeah.
When you've studied it or learned it, start putting it into practice? What are the first signs, and in personal experience, that, all right. Yeah. Oh, all right. This is starting to work.
Yeah. I mean, if I'm giving a private class, for example, or even a group class, for example, that might be even a better example. I'll give people this practice of, okay, say to yourself mentally, you're going to walk, just like F.M. Alexander did in his experiments, and then say no to it, that there's choice. What's really funny is that there's a very palpable noticing just of how your body shifts. Like students, when they're doing a group class, they can see, oh my gosh, you released back into your heels, like you moved back in space a little bit when you said no to walking, right? They're prima facie evidence that thought influences the physiology, right? As I told them to think no, they thought no in the right spirit, and there was a little shift in their body, right? Most of the time they can feel that. If they can't feel it, people can see it. And in a private lesson, we'll do that for about 5 minutes, and people are already starting to, oh, well, yeah, I did walk a little bit differently there. I did feel a little bit lighter in my walking there. Or I had a comment of, oh, I feel like I have ankles again.
Oh, wow.
Right? Just by taking those little moments here, take a couple steps, stop, renew the process, do it again, stop, renew the process. It's really wonderful how quickly it can shift you. Most people can feel it. Most people can feel it in about 5 to 10 minutes.
It's amazing how this can change lives, but not a lot of people know about it, or, haven't really. That's why we're talking about it, I guess. Spreading the word. Here's an interesting question. Harold checks in from Bridgeport, Connecticut. How does aging affect one's capacity to unlearn ingrained patterns? So essentially, the things we do, those habits, is it different when you get older? Can you teach an old dog new tricks? I'm an old dog.
Well, I mean, that always brings me back to the lovely quote of Walter Carrington's that I'm paraphrasing, but he said, and I think it's the right way of saying it, that old age is really the testing ground of the technique. That was his comment. And I think that the reason that he said that is that it's an exceptionally simple process, Steve, to get things to change. It really is not complicated, right? And I haven't ever seen anybody at any age, providing that their mental faculties are there, right, that hasn't been able to make some real powerful shifts in their body through the use of the principles of the Alexander technique. I haven't met one. And I'd say that's probably because it's not one of those things that relies on strength. It's one of those things that relies on removing the interferences to the strength that you have. A lot of the times we think that we're weak, but what we really are is we're interfered with. A lot of times we think we're weak when we get older, physically, but what we really are is, and certainly we are weaker than we were when we were younger, there's no doubt about that, but What we really are is we're just in the habit of being interfered with. And that's not actually a complicated thing to undo. It's a very simple thing when we're consistent about it.
Yeah, you often hear that they're stuck in their ways.
Yeah.
Or are we really? If you're intentional, it sounds like it doesn't matter how old you are, you can undo what you do.
Well, habits are like a circle. They're a feedback loop. It loops and it loops and it loops and it reinforces. All you have to do is break the loop somewhere around the loop. And if you break it in terms of its tension in the body, then you break it in terms of its tension in the mind. Right? And if you're tight in the body, you're going to be tight in the brain. And you just have to break the feedback loop somewhere, and you're off to the races.
Somebody reaches out to you. What's the starting point? And it can be anybody, anywhere, correct?
Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah. So I'd say the starting point is just getting to know how they're moving, for their benefit and for mine, getting to understand, okay, what's going well with your walking and what are you noticing that's different perhaps about, I'm just giving it as an example of walking, but what's different about how one foot's making connection to the floor to the other? Those are just practices of helping them start to get in tune with how their body's behaving. It's not with the intention of changing anything yet. It's just the practice of awareness, one of the principles of the Alexander technique. And then we'll of course analyze what kind of pains that they might have in their body and things that they're feeling, things like that, of course. And then we're just going to work on some non-doing. The principle is saying no and recognizing choice, which is the neutral setting, the neutral ground of allowing things to free up. And then helping them lightly think their way towards independence around these interferences that they're experiencing. Little shift happens. Let's go for a walk. Let's see how that goes. Let's see what they notice. You notice a difference here. Great. Guess what? You just formed a new habit, my friend. You just formed a new neuromuscular habit, a new neuromuscular pathway that's closer to the authentic you that you were born with having. And then we keep rinse, washing, and repeating that cycle. Now, does it get everybody out of pain? Of course not. I can only promise you that I'm going to get you out of pain according to the amount of pain you're in from the use that you have. But a lot of pain is from our use. Right? And then when we change how we use our coordination, then those things can start alleviate themselves over time. But ultimately, what I'm aiming for, and I want to highlight this, is to not fix their problems, but to teach them how to fix their problem. Right? Ultimately, if I'm doing a lesson with them, especially if it's a remote lesson, I'm wanting to get them to truly understand the meaning behind the word no and non-doing, the point of absolute necessity to understand. Without it, we're not doing the technique. To get them to just move the energy a little bit differently in their head, neck, and back, and then take action on that. And if I can get them to understand that process, they understand the technique. And now it's just a matter of doing it and doing it and doing it in everything that they do.
And I guess applying it to, once you've fully understood it, you've learned it, applying it to other parts of your life, that awareness. I got to believe too, non-doing, undoing is probably a challenge because we're so programmed in our society to do. How do I change my life? Well, here's what you need to do, but this is the opposite of that. Travis, what's the best way to connect with you?
You can reach me at my website, www.bodymindbalanceco.com, or if you feel like emailing me, bodymindbalanceco@gmail.com.
Starts with a conversation. You can do this for anybody, anywhere. we covered a lot today, even just recapping the history of the technique, how it's changed your life. And thank you to everybody who checked in. Instant feedback, steve@gmail.com. Got any questions? We'll be around. We'd love to entertain them, answer them, even comments. Maybe you've done it. I'd love to hear from somebody that has practiced the technique and has noticed a very positive change in their lives. Travis, thank you for being here today. Really appreciate it. And if you want to come and shovel snow, I know that you're lacking a little bit there in Colorado, but we got some over here.
I can teach you how to use yourself well with the shovel, Steve. What do you think? Come on, bro.
Yeah.
Let's do this together.
Or I could go on a Facebook group and say, does anybody want a shovel for $100 or whatever it is?
Exactly.
All right. Thank you so much for today. We'll catch up next time.
All right, friend.
Appreciate it.
This is the Global Podcast Network, where executives and professionals connect, share, and inspire. Stay tuned for the conversations that drive success.